In this lecture, I'll be discussing the reemergence of evolutionary thought, building off of the work of the 19th century evolutionary thinkers, but taken in a different direction, particularly by Leslie White and Julian Steward. I'll also look at Neomaterialism and Neofunctionalism. Again, the neo-evolutionary thought, primarily by Steward, a unilineal approach, and then or by White, a unilineal approach, and by Steward, a multilineal approach. In terms of neo-materialism, we have the work of Freud, who has done work in terms of evolution of the state and the development of state in the context of social complexity. Marvin Harris's work on cultural materialism, as well as Roy Rappaport's work looking at the importance and discussing the importance of ritual and religious belief in overall functioning of the ecosystem as a whole. And then we'll talk about Eric Wolf's work a little bit and the influences that he had from Emanuel Wallerstein and Andre Gunder Frank. In Margaret Mead's 1973 retrospective account of her career in anthropology, she discusses the changing nature of anthropology over the course of her career. She discusses the history of anthropology and its development, her particular engagement with anthropology, as well as employment opportunities for anthropologists as a whole. She, much like Franz Boas, notes that anthropologists are working with vanishing materials. So there's some elements of this idea of salvage ethnography that we see from the Boasians here. And the notion of reliability is possible within anthropology. And this really gets to Marvin Harris's discussions of the Emic Edict that we'll talk about in this section, as well as some of the work of Ruth Benedict and Malinowski as well in their discussions of the Emic Edict. And again, this is an important thread that runs throughout the class. This idea of whether cultural anthropology is a science, whether it should be, and what the ramifications of that are, in fact, from a theoretical perspective. The area of specialization in anthropology is shrinking, and at the same time we see increased fragmentation within the discipline, a number of specialties that are developing. And Mead notes that anthropology has really shifted over time, that historically before World War II it was much more like a vocation, and we talked a little bit about the notions of professionalization in the context of anthropology as a whole and in doing field work. And Mead contends that something is lost with this notion of professionalization as a whole. The political nature is becoming more evident when Mead's writing. We have the reflexive turn in a number of post-movements in the 1960s and 70s, which lead to larger societal questioning, particularly of functionalist paradigms, and more conflict-driven, looking at things like the emergence of ethnicity, place, space, and voice overall within anthropology and outside of it as well. We note during this time period that there starts to be an emergence of participation in so-called informants within fieldwork. And again, the terminology of informants is also somewhat dubious and questioned by anthropologists who note that perhaps other markers, such as the people that I work with, might be a more effective way to describe the work of anthropologists and engagements with community members that they're working with. Mead also notes that the collection of information by anthropologists is going to be used in a multitude of ways. And I talked a little bit in class that for all of Mead's activism, she's certainly drawn fire from a number of scholars, including David Price, who's done extensive work on anthropology and militarization, but also Laura Nader and Hugh Gusterson for their work in studying up and looking at her relative silence in light of atomic bomb testing in the South Pacific, where she was doing her field work. Mead also notes the role of anthropologists in cultural revival. So here, certainly anthropologists are getting off their veranda, getting into the field and not only engaging in participant observation, but seeing how the work that they are doing can contribute to a sense of cultural revitalization as a whole. And this goes in line with Soltax's descriptions of action anthropology, that the role or goal of anthropology is actually twofold: for the scientific collection of information, as well as the accurate and politically expedient representation of indigenous peoples and those that we work with as a whole in larger political spheres. Again, this is Soltax's work in action anthropology. In terms of the neo-evolutionary thought, there are two main strands, that of Julian Steward and that of Leslie White. Steward was a student of Kroeber and Lowy, so we have influence here from Franz Boas. He studied environmental adaptation of particular societies, and his first research indeed was in archaeology, and he moves over to ethnography and studies a number of different groups of native peoples in North America, most notably the Shoshone. He studied the parallel developmental sequences of evolution of civilizations in the New and Old World, or multilineal evolution. He comes up with some terminology in terms of ranking. Again, these are typologies here in terms of organization in society as a whole, from family, multifamily, and state-level societies. Steward's influence in anthropology is fairly dramatic. We can see strands of Julian Steward's work in cultural ecology and multilineal evolution in the context of the work of many, not only his work, but the work of many of his students. Most notably amongst these are students that he had at Columbia: Sidney Mintz, Eric Wolfe, Roy Rappaport, Robert Manners, Morton Freed, and Robert Murphy. And we'll talk more about these individuals as we go through most of the lecture. We'll certainly talk about Sidney Mintz a little bit more. He was most noted probably for his work in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico in particular, and his texts, Sweetness and Power, where he looks at the place of sugar in modern history, looks at how the transatlantic slave trade occurred with sugar production, rum production, shipment overseas, and then transatlantic slave trade in unison with the trade of goods as a whole. And so we can see global processes in play here. Mintz also contends in this book that industrial agriculture here, plantation agriculture on the sugar plantations, essentially it becomes a model for industry rather than vice versa. So it's a rather interesting argument that he makes here in terms of things like division of labor in different tasks throughout the plantation in order to process sugar. Eric Wolfe is known for his book Europe and the People Without Histories, contributed quite a bit to political anthropology. He's associated at Michigan, as is Roy Rappaport. We'll talk about both of those later. Robert Manners has an excellent essay on population issues and really uses Julian Steward's idea of cultural ecology to essentially rip apart some of the neo-Malthusian theorists, most notably Paul Ehrlich, for his contentions that the population of the Earth is problematic, and particularly problematic in so-called less developed or third world countries. Morton Freed, we'll talk about him in the context of evolutionary transitions and social complexity. And then Robert Murphy co-published with Julian Steward, looking at trappers and traders in the context, also drawing from Eleanor Leacock's work, who we'll talk about in the context of gender and anthropology, to make the argument essentially following Frederick Engels for the rise of private property in the state and the subjugation of females as this occurs, as there's a transition from production at the level of household or kinship organization all the way up to capitalist systems. Women become more marginalized within society as a whole. So we see the import of gender here in these analyses as well as earlier work from Margaret Mead. Leslie White was a student of Sapir, so again, a connection here with the Boasians. The unilineal evolutionary theory was fundamentally sound. So he is a very outspoken critic of the Boasians, of Boas, of the notion of cultural relativism, as well as the idea of historical particularism and its refutation of unilineal evolution, because he maintains that it's fundamentally sound. He believes that evolutionary development occurred from simple to complex societies with increasing specialization of the parts. And he sees this in the context of biology, and he also makes the contention that we can apply this in the context of cultures as well, so that there is no sharp divide between social cultural systems and biological ecological systems. So in this sense, he's very much a positivist type of thinker, one sort of approach overall. And so he's very much interested, following the unilineal evolutionists, in a science of culture. And remember, Boas was critical of the early 19th century evolutionists because of their methodology. And Leslie White contends that he has a universal measurement which can be applied cross-culturally, irregardless of the particular cultural circumstance, and that measurement is energy. In 1943, he expands on this in his work, Energy and Evolution of Culture, maintaining that it is in fact the key element. He's created the University of Michigan, which is a real powerhouse within anthropology, historically as well as today. His influence was fairly dramatic as well. He also influenced Eric Wolf. He influenced Marshall Sahlins, Alvin Service, and Robert Canero. Canero is known for his work in archaeology and environmental circumscription. His major works, The Science of Culture, A Study of Man and Civilization in 1949, he notes that other factors remaining constant, culture evolves as the amount of energy harnessed per capita per year is increased, or as the efficiency of the instrumental means of putting the energy to work is increased. The energy factor is the primary and basic one. Tools are merely the means that serve this power. And since increase of energy fosters improvement of tools, one may say that it is energy that at bottom carries the cultural process onward and upward. Again, also known for his works on the evolution of culture, the concept of culture, and the concept of cultural systems, a key to understanding tribes and nations. To compare White and Steward, Steward again has a multilinear evolutionary approach, which is specific and relativistic. He analyzed the adaptation of each culture within its specific environment in the context of cultural ecology, looking at the core features, the cultural core that related to subsistence as a whole, and the more secondary features that did not relate directly to subsistence. White's evolutionary scheme, on the other hand, was general, and he abandons the notion of cultural relativism contra the Boasians. Culture can be measured for White by specific and absolute standards. In other words, energy use is his universal scale that he uses to measure advancement within cultures. In the 1960s, Marshall Sahlins and Elman Service attempt to reconcile these approaches, and they suggest that evolution follows two paths, neither one of which are mutually exclusive. First, you have general evolution, following White, a grand movement from simple to complex, or Morton Freed, and then specific evolution, a change of individual cultures in response to their particular environmental circumstances. So here we can clearly see the influence of Julian Steward's work. Marshall Sahlins is best known for his work in Stone Age economics. He's associated with the University of Michigan. He was a student of White, Steward, as well as Carl Polanyi, who was an economist, who came up with a number of, who was a real contributor in the context of economic anthropology. He was engaged in protest of the Vietnam War. He used Richard Lee's work on the Kong Bushmen in the Kalahari to essentially argue that those individuals were occupying the original affluent society by following the Zen road to prosperity. By desiring less, they felt a sense of affluence in their life overall. And he compared this to, in terms of, in the context of ecological anthropology, Richard Lee's work and Marshall Sahlins' work, they look at things like behavioral observation and look at how long the Kong Bushmen were involved in subsistence practices. And they noted that this was actually quite a bit less than the average working time for Americans at the time. So they really called into question this idea of cultural superiority. So much in line with the idea of cultural relativism as a whole. More recently, Marshall Sahlins has resigned from the National Academy of Sciences for two reasons. First, its involvement with military activities, and second, the appointment to the National Academy of Sciences of Napoleon Chagnon, who did work amongst the Yanomami, who's been somewhat discussed in Tierney's work on Darkness and El Dorado, where Tierney discusses James Neal's work amongst the Yanomami, and how there was potentially nuclear testing, and anthropologists were complacent in that as a whole. So because of the appointment of Napoleon Chagnon, Marshall Sahlins resigned from the National Academy of Sciences in protest. And so this is, I mean, these are events, these are theorists who are still have quite a bit of import within
Anthropology, as Falcone would say, their how has not been diminished. They are still cited and noted in the context of anthropology as a whole.